Good morning, everyone. Just about still morning. I'm going to take a look at the introduction to tendering. So this is really geared at maybe some of you who've never been involved with procurement and tendering before. Equally, it might be that you've joined a team, a company as a new recruit, and this has suddenly become your role and you're having to find out all about it. So it's going to be quite high level. We'll go through a number of topics just to have a look at the public sector marketplace, which is really quite different from doing what I would call normal commercial business. We'll have a little bit of a look at who the customers are and what they buy, how do they buy. So some of this, I guess, from Gordon's presentation, if you've been listening to that for the NHS, what we'll try to do is show you what else is there apart from the NHS procurement. I'm not going to spend too much time on rules and regulations, but probably just the basics that you're going to need to know to get through the processes and procedures. Finding opportunities is important, and that, I think, for the organisations that we deal with, sometimes that's the most pressing thing that you need to find out about. And we'll say a little bit about responding to a tender and what's needed to bid. Intend is a provider for the Supplier Development Programme, so we're involved in doing a lot of the training throughout Scotland. The training covers lots of different modules, so if you haven't had a look at that, please get onto their website and go up to their stand today as well. But during the course of that sort of training, really we get all sorts of questions. And as lots of people say, the procurement process is a bit tricky sometimes. But in our experience, and we are dealing largely with smaller micro businesses, once you put a bit of investment of time in, get yourselves organised, get familiar with the procedures and some of the documents, it's absolutely not impossible for some of the very smallest companies to be winning quite decent-sized tenders. And we'll talk a little bit in this presentation about the different sizes of tenders that you might want to look at, depending on your experience level. Also to think about whether, if looking at all of this presentation, it's not for me, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of opportunities for you to be a subcontractor. So the companies will win the work, but they need a supply chain themselves. So it's up to you really to make sure that you know in the public sector what's going on. So the public sector marketplace, overall, obviously we've seen a little bit about the NHS, but it's £11 billion in Scotland every single year goes through procurement. And procurement is where the public body buys from outside. So this is not a budget that they're spending internally on their own staffing or sometimes labour organisations. So it's quite tempting to think of it almost like a big sweetie shop, but it's also quite a danger to be a bit scattergun and pile in and have a look. So you need to be quite organised in terms of what you think you want to be looking at. And also there are very strict rules, and if any of you are involved in commercial selling, I know some of my background where you meet a client or a potential client, you get to know them. If they like you, you put a proposal in, it's kind of nice, your own format, you get the business, and then you can keep the business for as long as you like, as long as things go well. Public sector, very, very different. It's done on cycles. The contracts, probably most of them might not be longer than 4 years. So, and in order to get them, you've got to submit your proposals in what sometimes feels like quite rigid formats. So there are some of you that might look at the public sector in certain areas and think this is absolutely not for me, and that's fine. But certainly I think most of our clients that we deal with, they've got a mix of public sector and maybe some commercial or subcontracting business as well. But one of the main things is this best value for money. It's quite a difficult term to define, but certainly legally now in Scotland, tenders can't be awarded on a price-only basis. So that, I think, is quite interesting. So at least maybe even 10%, but usually more of a contract will be down to what in procurement speak would be called quality. Quality is all about the technical questions. How are you going to deliver the contract, the supplies, the goods? And as you start to look through different tenders, we'll talk about this when we're finding tenders, you'll see that in certain sectors, I'm just trying to think of examples, like consultancy, for example, might be typically 70% quality, 30 price, some construction. I'm speaking to somebody upstairs from one of the councils, and they've got 90% price, but 10% quality. But even within the quality, there's a lot of questions to answer to get right. So best value is there as a kind of driving force for the buyers themselves. When it comes to who the buyers are, where you think you might be interested, there's all sorts of areas in the public sector, and this is maybe something that we come across quite regularly. People will gravitate towards the councils, NHS, maybe the police, universities and colleges, the kind of big buyers. But if you're a small company or if you're just new to the area, realistically, you may not be able to get in for a very big contract that might have minimum turnover levels, for example. The competition's going to be very big on some of the very big contracts. So what I would urge you to do, and you'll find this as well on the Public Contract Scotland portal. If anyone doesn't know what that is, you'll find it just by Googling, or you can check PCS stand is upstairs as well. But this is where PCS is where all public sector tenders valued over £50,000 must legally now be advertised. So PCS in Scotland, place to go. If you're dealing south of the border, much more difficult. Tenders tend to be advertised in lots of different places. But these circles at the bottom, we've got the non-departmental public bodies, which is a bit jargony. Executive agencies, now these are just examples that I've given, but within those there's almost hundreds of different bodies, and they need desks and chairs, consultancy services, food vending machines, high-end equipment, everything. So they will be buying it, but they might be buying it on a smaller scale that's a lot more accessible for the size of your business. So our connection here is not good, and we don't really have the time to go online, but I'm happy to see somebody up at the SDP stand. A search for buyer on Public Contract Scotland is a fabulous way just to track through, see what sort of contracts are coming out, and identify maybe just some of those smaller organisations that might be worth speaking to, that might be better suited if you're a smaller body. Okay, but obviously the larger ones are there in the centre, housing associations. A good example at the moment, some of you may be aware, I think somebody's doing a talk on the new legislation for the smoke and heat and carbon monoxide detectors. So the housing associations are putting out almost dozens of contracts every week for the last few months to buy in services, to do the installations, to meet the regulations. So housing associations, again, massive market, loads of contract opportunities. What do they buy? We could probably spend the next hour just going through all the different things, but even just, again, if you do a kind of browse the notices on Public Contract Scotland with a few keywords, you're going to start to get a feel for not just the routine things maybe that you would expect, like the trades contracts, care at home contracts, all the kind of big ones that we know about. But in between, there's the most amazing range of either services or supplies or works, tends to be the three categories. Some of you might look at that and recognise some of the things that you supply already. The most exotic one, I think, that I intend have worked on, we were asked to help somebody in Fife who has birds of prey. And he was working with Fife Council, and he took his Harris Hawk and walked round the waste station. Kept the birds away because nobody's legally allowed to destroy the birds. And he'd been doing that for quite some years, and that went out to tender. So we worked with him, got his tender, but it's an example of a very unusual service, but again, for a council, so it goes through the very formal route. If you are starting to find some examples of contracts that you're interested in, it is very important to know something quite specific about the environment in Scotland, and that is, since 2008, this what we call the procurement structure, and it's a kind of a pyramid, and at the bottom level, what they call Category C contracts. This is a normal public authority, if you like, a contracting authority, has a requirement, goes out to tender, they manage the whole tender themselves, and it's largely only for them. So probably, I would say maybe the bulk of tenders would come into that category. At the next level up is the C1 collaborative, and that's usually a sort of regional, maybe, collaboration. It's quite common for the Ayrshire councils, for example, to do a tender together. One of them will take the lead, but you need to read the contract notice carefully because it could be North Ayrshire as the lead, but the services have to be for South and East Ayrshire as well. So it makes it a much bigger contract, which potentially, obviously, can be very good, or if you're too small, it might constrain you a little bit. The Category B is quite a big area for contracting, and it is important that you find out if any of your products or services come into this kind of sector-specific area. What will happen here is organisations like Scotland Excel, who buy on behalf of all the local authorities, and quite often housing associations with that, APOC, who represent universities and colleges, NHS have a national sector-specific central buying body as well. They will put out usually frameworks, and a framework is effectively, it's an approved list, although those aren't sort of legally allowed nowadays, but a tender goes out and a list of suppliers will tender, be accepted, and then that becomes the supply base, usually for the next 4 years. So in certain areas, I was trying to think, a good example is something like workwear. So Scotland Excel will have a framework contract for workwear, PPE, high-vis jackets, all these sort of things. There'll be certain suppliers on that, so you need to know if that ties up your part of the market, or could you be a supplier to them, for example, as well? So this Category B area is definitely worth a little bit of searching. All of the bodies that you find, the buyers, including Scotland Excel, APOC, you can do a search for buyer, and it brings up their buyer profile on Public Contract Scotland, and you'll see contracts open to tender, contracts that have been awarded, future contracts, maybe what they call a prior information notice. And they also, on PCS, have something called a forward plan, which is just really a big Excel spreadsheet, so you can actually identify when some of these big contracts are going to come up for renewal. So bear in mind the pyramid. Category A is the final one, and that's for really big public sector-wide contracts. So it tends to be utilities. I think there used to be one, there's stationery, copiers, management consultancy, I think used to be one as well. But again, you would find all of that on PCS. So this is getting a little bit into the realms now of the rules and regulations. There's 3 levels of buying that you need to be aware of. The first one is potentially the most important if you're a newcomer to public sector tendering, or perhaps you're a smaller organisation. It's classed as unregulated, but I think any of you that have started to get involved in procurement might know it better as the quick quotes area. What's important about quick quotes is obviously it's below a threshold, so that's currently £50,000 in value. That might be over a few years, so it might not be 50,000 per annum. But it doesn't get published on, a quick quote doesn't get published on Public Contracts Scotland. The buyer will put together the requirements and then use Public Contracts Scotland to find a number of suppliers who are then invited to quote. That is generally, I would have thought, normally a minimum of 3, could be 5, could be quite a few more. But for us as suppliers, the deal is we don't know a quick quote's gone out unless we're actually receiving it ourselves. So if anything in your kind of visits today to people, promoting yourself, saying I'm interested in quick quotes is definitely a good starting point. We'll see a little bit later, and in fact my colleague Owen after the break will cover how to improve your bid score, but I'll have a quick look at the supplier finder profile, and this is the part of PCS that you need to fill in to be visible for quick quotes. The regulated level is anything from 50,000 up to what are currently European Union thresholds for tendering. So on the far right, everything over the thresholds gets treated through EU regulations. Everything regulated in Scotland will be treated under Scottish procurement rules. There's actually not a massive difference between the two areas. In Scotland, there's a particular emphasis on sustainable procurement and what they call the sustainable duty for the buyers, which is in the EU regulations, but is very, you'll see it in tenders. It comes through things, a bit like was mentioned earlier with the social value discussion through Scotland Excel, community benefits and so on. So as a supplier, I don't think you need to be too worried about the difference between the regulated and what they call the OJEU, the official journal of the EU levels. People ask what's going to happen post-Brexit. Probably not a massive change, to be absolutely honest. I actually think the Scottish regulations are actually tougher, to be honest, than the EU. So by losing the EU, we're not going to suddenly have a free-for-all or the return to, I think you'd mentioned, Gordon, just geese the job approach. That's not going to happen. All the different instruments and so on are all enshrined in either Scottish or UK-wide regulations. Sitting within each buying authority, and particular for local authorities, is what they call the standing orders, and this is the internal regulations. So obviously, as the amounts get higher, you start to see what we had on the last slide, regulated, quick quotes, but you can find out all of this on the websites, the procurement websites of any of the buying authorities. And it will tell you, maybe at the higher level then, say something under 3,000, best value, you could get a direct approach from someone, or if they've worked with you before, for example, it does allow for the buyers not to have to go out to quote at certain levels. Those figures will vary with different types of buyers, so you will probably have to check that for each individual one. Okay, so that's a little bit the regulatory side. Another part of the regulations is what we call the tendering procedures, procurement procedures. So we've talked a little bit about the quick quote. I'll come on to that again a bit later. The next two are the most commonly used procedures for tendering, and it's quite important to understand the difference between them. The restricted procedure is really exactly as it says. So all bidders can go in at a first stage, and it's what they call the selection stage, or a kind of it used to be called the pre-qualification. And this is where you'll also find what they call the ESPD, which I'll come on to shortly. But the most important thing is, although everyone at this stage can put in their initial submission, which will be kind of backwards looking, so who you are, maybe some sort of legal information in terms of the setup, your VAT number, there's a certain number of business probity questions, you know, to make sure that you sort of self-certify that you're doing business legally. You would probably be asked for examples at this stage of work that you've done up to date. All of this to kind of get you through that first stage. You might end up with 30, 40, 50 organisations bidding at this stage, but only a certain number are going to get through, and it's up to the buyer to decide that. But typically, it might be something just between 5 and 10. So if you don't get to grips with the questions at the restricted stage, you're not even going to get the chance to get through to put your tender in, how will you do the job, and more importantly, your price, if you're competitive, particularly for a small organisation where you might have an advantage. The restricted, you will then go on to a second stage, which is the tender stage, but only the people who go to that stage will get the documents. Okay, but you should always get feedback from the buyer as to why you didn't get through at the restricted stage. The open procedure, and there are some buying organisations who routinely always use just open, they don't go down restricted route. It still has the restricted stage in it, but when you put your bid in, you do your ESPD, or the kind of selection questions, then you do your tender, the technical questions, and your price, so everything goes in at once. So for smaller organisations, that's quite nice because you get an equal chance then really without this filtering system. There's the framework, which I mentioned earlier. Now the frameworks will work either restricted or open as well, but the framework is an instrument which puts together, I think I mentioned earlier with these corporate collaborative buying organisations, the framework, it can still be with one supplier, but the deal with the framework is it's not a guarantee of any work. So you get on a framework and then you have to wait and see what comes along after that. The opposite of that would be something like a term contract, measured term contract. There's a beginning, an end, and the work is yours. It's guaranteed, and you just have to go and deliver that. Okay, so that's a little bit as the types of either procedures you're going to find and the type of contracts, whether it's a framework or otherwise. All of that information is in the contract notice. So when you're browsing on Public Contract Scotland, you see something you like, you have to express an interest, but it will then take you into an area where there's something called the full text, and that's the contract notice. And it's in that you're going to find all these different elements. That area as well is where you're going to pick up all the documents and to start to read through what's been asked for. If you're not used to using PCS, you can't break it. So I would encourage you to go on, and if there's any tender whatsoever that you look at and you think, I want to have a look at this, I don't want to submit anything necessarily, I'm going to go in, register an interest, get the documents, read them all, share it with my colleagues, blah, blah, blah. You can do all of that and leave it and just not submit it, and nobody's going to be any the wiser. There is a box, I think, where you can withdraw your interest, but really it's the best possible way as a kind of novice to start to get used to the different documents and how they're presented. Otherwise, you're going to wait for this great contract for you, and then you're going to be kind of scrabbling around trying to work out what's what. So Public Contract Scotland, absolutely the go-to place for finding opportunities. Once you've registered, which is a very straightforward process, first of all, you're actually asked for the alert profile. So you have to choose some, what I think they call them, used to be called categories, but they're using common procurement vocabulary now. But it's effectively keywords. Choose your keywords, and then you'll immediately start to get some email alerts every time a contract comes up that matches what you've put in. The next thing you need to fill in is this supplier finder profile. It's very straightforward. It'll have your basic details in already. You choose some geographical areas where you might be interested to work. There's a box which asks you to put in a description of who you are and what you can offer. Don't put in a one line, please, because it's not enough, but don't put in War and Peace. So just a nice, clear summary. Here's the services we offer. Any qualifications, awards, accreditations you've got. Name drop any clients that you're working with, particularly if they're going to be quite impressive, and especially if they're public sector. It could be something to do with your people, anything really that you think make you sort of rise above the crowd. But don't do kind of big deal, what I would say, like, it's not a brochure, so don't want like, we're high value, we're people-centred. Absolutely, a bit like a CV, quite factual, quite straightforward. Get that filled in, and then obviously you maybe have to do a bit more kind of normal marketing, I would say, to raise your profile. You can get the search for buyer here. You can access contract registers. So all public bodies over a certain spend must have a contract register, and it's a list of everything in place, which will give you details of who's won the contract, so you can find some competitors, and when it's due for renewal as well. So it's a fabulous source of kind of market intelligence. You'll get contact details of buyers, so every contract notice that comes out generally will have a named person against it as well. And then the award notices. So aside from the contracts register, as the contracts are coming through, the award notices will be published as well. The award notices will sometimes, I think actually quite usually, give you the value of the contract as well. So that can be really helpful market information. If you're looking at the contract notices, trying to decide, is it for us? Two things to be aware of. A lot of people look at the notice and they think, oh, it's fantastic, but they haven't noticed it's an award. It's not the actual notice that you can bid for. But do also, towards the end of the notice, you might get some mandatory requirements. It can be a minimum turnover, so in which case don't go and start filling in all the documents because you may not get through. Or it might be that you need a certain qualification to get through. That tends to be more in a sort of trades area or, gas safe, something like that. So you might want to be contacting buyers directly, particularly to let them know that you're interested in quick quotes. You have to do this with a bit of care. Obviously, today's a free-for-all because they're all sitting, waiting, ready to hear from you. Aside from your supplier finder profile, you might want to have what I would call a capability statement because you can't do much formatting in the supplier finder profile or pictures or whatever. You might find that's useful if you're engaging with someone, and you can send that through as well. Depending on how far you want to be looking for the business, you might want to be logging on to other portals. So the UK has Sell to Wales, Northern Ireland portal, the European database TED gives you all the EU level tenders in every European country. There's one here that I find really useful, Pro Contract Due North. So is there anybody bidding south of the border interested? No, in Scotland? Yeah, it's a few. So Pro Contract Due North now is starting to get a lot of local authorities, public bodies coming through. All of those are free. B2B Alert is one that is a paying one, but gets maybe smaller, lower value contracts coming through. And there's a whole raft of kind of pay-for services out there as well. PCS has subcontract opportunities. So I think maybe, I can't remember if some of the tier 1 contractors are here, but any big contract, particularly construction, part of their contract is that they have to advertise subcontract work, not just use their own supply chain. So in PCS, you'll be able to search. There is a kind of quite close to where you start browsing notices. You can click for search subcontract as well. The other thing to think about, obviously, when you're finding opportunities is that you may look, frameworks are maybe quite a good example where there's a lot of work and requirements maybe pulled together and you can't provide all of the service. You might start having to look for partners. There's not a problem in most contracts, I think, that you bring on subcontractors. You would normally have to name them as far as you know. And sometimes they're perhaps more partners rather than subcontractors who would share the risk with you. I just wanted to highlight one scheme which is available. There's consultancy help available for SMEs. It's through Cooperative Development Scotland, and they have put together the legal documents to form what they call a consortium cooperative company. So you retain your own company, but it's a bit like a consortium vehicle, if you like. It's a company limited by guarantee, £1 liability, £40 to set it up. But it's being used increasingly by groups of, we've got some for IT, consultants, executive coaches. I worked with some people in the northeast in Aberdeen, and they've come together with 6 of them, and they've all got complementary skills, and they're now bidding for work up with the oil and gas community that was too big for them individually before. So have a think about that, maybe look at the CDS website, but there are free consultancy days to help you get that consortium set up. This is the supplier finder profile. So this is the one that you need to look at for quick quotes. There's a couple of things. It's very hidden below, on this slide. You can find this when you go onto PCS. If you click on supplier in the tab at the top, and it brings you into a control panel, and on the bottom left-hand corner is where all your alert profile and supplier finder are. When you open it up, the very first thing at the top, it says public and private, and a lot of people interpret that to be public sector, private sector, which I think is quite logical. It's not. Public means you're published, and if it's got private, it means you're invisible, basically. So if you want to check that next time you're on PCS, make sure that that's filled in. Below Supplier Finder, the details I think I gave you before, so very straightforward to fill that in. And here is the search for buyer tab as well. So on the left-hand side, literally, if you know the buyer, you can obviously put their name in, but this is where I would maybe putting in things like housing association, housing in the title, and it will bring up, I think it's about 150 different organisations. Slightly further down, you have the sector, so it's sitting at all just now, but if you click on that, you get a drop-down list, and it gives you these, non-public NP, DBs, executive agencies. So you can click on that and then literally just start to browse through to find maybe organisations that you've never heard of, to be honest, but who all have to use PCS. When you click on a buyer's name, you get what is called the buyer profile. And I think I mentioned earlier, just a series of tabs then. Current contracts. So if, for example, you're waiting for a contract to come out and you're not quite sure if it's come through your alerts, this is the fail-safe way to find it. Click on current contracts, you'll get them open. Future can be quite helpful for these kind of prior notices. You've got awards, and you also have the contracts register, but this will be the contracts register here just for Falkirk Council. So at the higher level, you can search the contract register across all the buyers. So responding to a tender, as I say, the quick quotes, again, it's really not a full tender, although I have seen some that are quite extensive, but it tends to be more about the price and a bit of background. Restricted, say we've mentioned before, with this ESPD, which I'll just come on to shortly. And then the open tenders, they would use the ESPD more as a pass-fail rather than scoring it, but then all the scoring would be through your technical and your pricing. You'll see the reference to MEET used in procurement, and that's most economically advantageous tender. And all that means is the combined price and quality score. And it's that combined score that gives the ranking to see who gets the work. The tender applications are submitted two different ways, really. Either the buyer will choose to stay within the Public Contract Scotland system, so the notice gets published there, you open up the documents, and then you use what they call the postbox. And the ESPD can be sitting there as well. Or they'll go through PCS Tender, which is a totally separate software system. So you need to be registered separately for both of those. The Supplier Development Programme does a training course specifically on PCS and PCS Tender. You could check that one out. Otherwise, I've put the link in and you can go through and register for that. On PCS Tender, you are able to fill in a profile, so it's quite a bit of background information relating to that ESPD, and that will sit there, and then when you bid for something, all the documents, the content gets fed into the questionnaire. So it could be quite nice as a bit of a time saving if you want to do that in advance. The ESPD, I apologise for the jargon, but it is something that's being used across Europe. So we have a business in the Netherlands, and our clients there have to fill in exactly the same document that we have here in Scotland. But it is a means, really, of making sure that people are suitable to bid and that they have the right experience. The big deal is that you do a lot of what we call self-certifying. So in the olden days, you would do a PQQ, pre-qual questionnaire, and you had to put in policies, evidence, insurance. So if you were bidding every day of the week, it was a huge piece of work to do. Here, you tick the box, and if you get selected, or if you get taken to the next stage, then you put the evidence in. So it reduces the work. I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but part 1 and 2, part 1, the buyer puts in. Part 2, bidder information, all totally straightforward. The only thing to watch for in part 2 is that I'll ask you, and the language here is a bit weird, entities that you rely on. So that means either a subcontractor, or it might be a partner if you're in a consortium group, or, and I have had this with a couple of clients, in order to get over the minimum turnover clause, they've had to rely on maybe a parent company, somebody else relied on somebody in their supply chain. So it's for digital signing. So it was a massive big American company, produced all the signs, and they relied on them as the financial guarantor, if you like, for the tender. So part 2 shouldn't be hard. Part 3 is very easy, but it looks horrible, and it's all sorts of, are you corrupt? Are you involved in child trafficking? Have you broken any health and safety rules? It's all basically tick the box, yes, no. And part 4 is the area where the buyer can decide what questions to put in. So, and this can be a little bit tricky if you're kind of new to the system. So it's not that this is a standard document, because part 4 is going to vary with every tender that you put in. So again, in the contract notice, read it carefully, because that should contain all the details. Insurance levels, is it going to ask you for projects? Does it want to know about plant and equipment, that kind of thing? Those are the kind of areas, the part 4. Sometimes you'll get tenders put out by someone who's not been trained how to use the ESPD, and they'll literally leave all of the questions open, even if they don't apply. So I've had some where it's for a service and they're asking for your product certification. Can we come and get samples? So you have to just get straight back through the Q&A and say, please confirm I don't have to fill this in. Again, unfortunately, there's a few formats, so the buyers can choose either to attach it in Public Contract Scotland, usually as a Word document, which is pretty horrible, I have to say. Better is that it's done through Public Contracts Scotland. So there might be, there's a module in the post box that you go to and just fill in the forms. And again, you can save those and upload them and use them at a later date. The third one here is when it's published on PCS Tender. Apologies, everyone, still for all this, all the acronyms. But again, this is quite straightforward. So PCS Tender, you go in, it has a qualification section, a technical section, and a commercial. And if you click on qualification, it is the ESP document that opens up. So again, if you've filled in, just from this last bullet point here, if you've already done your profile, or if you've already bid for something, most of that's going to be filled in already. So quite useful to plan in advance for that. Method statements are at the technical stage, and it's again totally up to the buyer to decide what sort of questions they want to ask you. Any of you that have bid before will know this can be quite challenging sometimes, and this is where the scoring is. So that quality price element. Owen's going to say more after the break about how to improve your bid score, so I'm not going to really repeat all of it, but it can be very open questions. You'll know, because there'll be a score against it, what the weighting is. You'll know how important it is. I've spoken to just a few buyers upstairs so far this morning, and every one of them said, if you're speaking to suppliers, can you please say, get them to read the question, get them to answer the question. And time and again, that's the issue, that people don't say enough or they don't answer all the parts of the question. Okay, so watch out for multiple questions within a question, for example, here. Legally, you have to get feedback, and there are lots of suppliers who don't ask for feedback, which hopefully you won't be one of those, because that really is how to improve. And the buyers, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are geared up to that and ready to give you a bit more detail on why you didn't get through. There's a lot of best practice in Scottish Government, and if you don't get feedback and you keep persisting and asking, you can actually go to something called the single point of inquiry, and they will take up your case, so to speak, and approach the buyer on your behalf. But in most cases, if you're reasonably persistent, you should get some form of feedback. You won't, if you failed on price ground, you won't unfortunately get a list of everybody else's prices to find out how far off you were, but occasionally you might get a feel for how close you were. Okay, so if you're a total novice, you might already be completely turned off by all of that, but I would encourage you. We've seen lots of brand new, literally into the market, small, even micro businesses get in and win contracts, not just quick quotes. It's taken a bit of work because it's generally information that people don't have to hand necessarily. But if this is your route to market, and the public sector is where some or all of your business is going to be, please take advantage of the help that's there. There's a whole list, again, of the supplier journey, which is obviously for us online, the procurement journey, which is quite interesting, so that's for the buyers, but it will tell you what they're being instructed to do in order to run a good tender. The Supplier Development Programme, you know, because you're all registered and you're here, but please use their website because they've got loads of events, meet the buyers that are maybe specific to an opportunity or specific to a sector and so on. I've also added in a note just towards the bottom, quite a number of local authorities and business gateways across Scotland have what they call a business expert help scheme, and usually procurement help is part of that. So if you're engaged with your local business gateway, they can allocate you even up to 3 days help that's free of charge to you as a small business. and that can be used to help. Maybe it's bidding for your first contract. As long as it's to do with growing your business, I would recommend asking maybe even the councils upstairs, if it's your home council, so to speak, if they have any schemes. And Just Enterprise does something a little bit similar for third sector organisations. Okay, and then just finally, SDP, you can go to any of their events. It doesn't have to be where you're based, but in the events calendar, if it is level 1 that you're looking for introductory, there's a few courses coming up, but you can browse your way through the full calendar and use that. And again, obviously, it's all free of charge as well. Okay, I'm happy to see folk. I think we're going into a break just now, if anyone wants to chat. Otherwise, I can arrange to see people up at the SDP site. Okay, thanks very much.